We still need to give the musicians ability to apply to gigs they want to perform. Since more musicians can apply to a lot of gigs, this means that more gigs can have more musician applications. This tells us that we need to create a little bit more complicated more-to-more model relationship. To achieve this, I will create an applications table in the database which will only have two fields, one for the gig ID and one for the musician ID. Now we can define this relationship in the user model. Employer will have the gigs they created and the musicians will have the gigs they applied to. To use these gig applications, we can create two methods in the user model. IsAppliedTo method will check if the user is applied to this gig. The other method will apply the user to the gig from the parameter. If the user is not applied to this gig already, we can append the gig to the applied gigs and add it to the database session. Now let's define the migration to create the applications table in the database. I will call this one Adding Musician Applications. We can create a view in the gig blueprint which will allow musicians to apply to gigs. Notice the request referrer redirection. This means that I want to redirect the user back to the site in which he made this request. It is kind of like a back button. User will use this apply view in two places. We can first implement this in the gig partial under the posted by employer element. If the active page is home and the logged in user is a musician, we can render this based on the IsAppliedTo condition. If the user is already applied to this gig, then I will render the disable button which will only say applied. However, if the user is not applied, then let's render the form which will use the applied view we created to apply the musician to this gig. The reason I also checked if this was the home page is because we will use this partial in some other pages soon and we only want this button to be shown on the musician's home page. Let's add the same thing to the show gig template. If the user is a musician, we can render the correct button for the gig application. Now that we allow them to apply to gigs, let's use this relationship to show applied musicians in some templates. For example, in this show gig template, I want to create a list of all the musicians that are applied to this gig. This musicians list has to be created, so let's create it in the show view of the gig blueprint. We want all of the musicians from the current gig. Let's also list the musicians on the home page if the current user is an employer. Here I want to filter all of the users that have a musician role. Now we can render this inside of the employers part of the home page, under the Create Gig button. Notice that I use this musician partial. This partial for rendering musician cards will be similar to the gig partial we created. I will create this partial inside of the main package templates. Now we can finally show all of the gigs that the musician is applied to on the musician's account page. If the user is a musician, find all of the gigs that he applied to. I want to create one more thing in the gig blueprint. My gigs view will show all of the gigs that musician is applied to. If the user is an employer, this page will then show all of the gigs this employer created. The template for this view is simple. If there are any gigs, we will render them with the gig partial in the form of cards. The context of these gigs is based on the role of the logged in user, as you can see here. Now we can add a link to the My Gigs view inside of the navigation bar. This link will be shown for all of the authenticated users. Now let's see what we created. I made some gigs just so we can see how all of this works. As a musician, I will try to apply to this gig by clicking on the Apply button. It seems like it worked. I got the flash message and also this button is now disabled. Now let's go to the show page of this gig and try to apply from here. This works too. Down here you can see all of the musicians applied to this gig. For now, it's just me. If I go to my account, I can also see my applications down here. My gigs page we created will also show all of the gigs I applied to. As an employer, I can now see all of the musicians on my home page. My gigs page will show all of the gigs I created with this account. I want to end this module with an exercise. Try to use the knowledge from the course to create an admin interface. There is no wrong way to do this, but I will give you some guidelines to follow. Download the admin exercise PDF from this module's exercise files. The first part of the PDF will give you the assignments, and then you can check out the rest of it to see how I did the administrator implementation. Good luck and thanks for watching this module. If you have any questions, ask them in the discussion.